So good afternoon, Dr. Janjal, Mr. Bharadwaj, Dr. Makshmar, Raghu, Mr. Batuda, Mr. Kocher, Mr. Kumar, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the Scotch Group and CAII for inviting me. I was looking forward to a great panel discussion, right, with the knowledgeable panelists, and this keynote was literally a surprise, and chairing was even more of a surprise. But let me put forward a few points. You've heard really that the importance of MSMEs, and a lot of MSMEs are showcasing themselves there. But I think one thing is clear, that most of the MSMEs are nurseries for entrepreneurship and innovation. MSMEs are also dispersed across the country and produce about 6,000 plus diverse range of products and services. And the share of services and the number of units in the services to manufacturing is roughly 3:1. I think what's very interesting is many MSMEs, and there are a lot of in this panel also, are flexible. They can adapt quickly to changing market demand and supply even high-end industries, including defense, aerospace, nuclear, right, and the space program. So if you look at the data that was mentioned earlier, and if you look at the MSME annual report for 2017-18, so they say about 63 million units, 111 million people employed, and it accounts for 45% of the output and around 40% of the total exports of the country. And the sector contributes around 30% of the GDP, or 33% of the gross value added if you look at different things. But if you look at different countries, and I've just taken a few like Brazil, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Singapore, South Africa, US, and even Taiwan, the share of GDP in those countries from SME stretches from 35 to 88%, Taiwan being 88%. The exception in this list is Brazil with 22%. If you look at employment, the share of employment ranges from 60 to 80%, Russia being 23%. However, comparisons across the countries is difficult because the definition of MSMEs in most of the countries actually differs, and 33% of the countries that have been looked at define MSME in terms of employment. Within India also, it was moved to actually redefine the concept of MSME to a turnover of 250 crores, but that has not happened because the bill has not been approved by Parliament. But this is something which needs to be done. We need to change the definition of MSMEs to actually address what needs to be looked at. Interestingly, if you look at the survey amongst MSMEs, it throws out some interesting data. 74% of the MSMEs are actually located in 10 states of India. 2 states, West Bengal and UP, account for 14% each of the number of SMEs. It's a very interesting thing, and you look at the next is Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra, 8%, and then you have states like Bihar, Karnataka in the top 10. As was mentioned by earlier, that the MSME sector has grown exponentially. The government has actually, over the past many years, done a number of things for the MSME industry, the latest being the 12-point agenda unveiled late last year. There are 4 dimensions under which we need to look at how we promote MSMEs, and there are experts here, so I'll only just touch upon briefly. The first is the regulatory environment. The regulatory environment defines the definition, the ease of registration, the number of laws you have to comply with, etc. Building an entrepreneurship culture within the country, the financial environment and financial support. If you look at these 4 elements, and this is what globally comparisons are done to compare the ease of doing business in this sector. These 4 points get checked when you look at the 12-point charter, but when it comes to policy and execution, there seems to be a gap. And despite being the gravity of the country's economy, MSMEs are still facing challenges in terms of all these 4 elements. The first really is the lack of adequate capital. And MSMEs, even the 59-minute loan is very interesting. It is available, and the 2% interest subvention is available for companies that are GST registered and pay GST, right? And at the other hand, you've gone and increased the limit of registration from GST from 20 lakhs to 40 lakhs. So that means companies up to 40 lakhs turnover don't get benefit of this scheme technically, although there are other schemes to address collateral-free loans for loans under 1 crore, etc., and the Mudra loans and the reinsurance from the loan default guarantee. But most MSMEs, and given the February 12th circular being interpreted by banks in a different way, although technically the February 12th circular is for companies around over 2,000 crores, but you're applying the same yardstick for companies, it creates a problem for the MSMEs who have other challenges like long payment issues and the discrepancy between the GST payment of 180 days versus the MSME Act payment of 45 days. So we need to actually address these issues going forward. It is in the initial stage that a person requires finance, but if you look at listing or looking at the way they look at it, should be in existence for 3 years, you have to show profit in your balance sheet, and therefore many of the MSMEs are actually set up with their own funds or borrowing from family and friends, and there's a need to be able to create an ecosystem that supports and encourages entrepreneurship. At the national level, there are schemes to support MSMEs. Some are pushed down to the state level. Now, many times the states actually act as an adjunct to the national programs, and other times the state replicates national programs and doesn't complement them. So if you really want to look at the second thing that could be done is looking at how the state schemes could add and supplement the national schemes to support the MSMEs in their states. And if you focus on the 10 states that account for 74% of the MSMEs, instead of spreading it all over, and that's a challenge because governments are not supposed to select and choose, and therefore you need to actually address the slate. In regulations, while a lot of being done is by the central regulations, state and local regulations, and if you take Delhi or you take any other states, the whole issue of ceiling and the use of private sector for residential, or whatever you look at it, or even the steps that were taken yesterday in Karnataka, it impacts a lot of different people. The second or third area is infrastructure. While there is a lot of focus within the industrial estates and creating, parks and things for MSMEs and to promote entrepreneurship, the area around the industrial estate or the approaches to the industrial estate are a challenge. So if I take a pharma company, inside the industrial or the pharma park, it might be great. But if I'm an inspector driving into that industrial park and I find stagnant water on both the sides of the road and find other issues, then perhaps my assessment of that company, despite it meeting all the things, may be colored. The other issue is the cost of doing business. While we have the ease of doing business, the cost of doing business and financial cost is only one aspect. Electricity, water, sewage, if you do your own generator, and if you are now currently in, let's say, Rajasthan, you are supposed to move all your generators from fossil fuel to piped natural gas or CNG, etc. So these changes that happen also impact the sector. There is also the issue of access to technology, and access to markets, but that are well known, so I won't dwell on that. Let me just share 3 stories. which illustrate what could be done. Many years ago, Chinese smoke a lot, right? So someone in China realized that there were a huge domestic market for lighters. But when they looked at their presence in the world market of lighters, there was zero. So they got together and said, okay, we'll do a fair in China. They will invite buyers of consumers of lighters, right? This was in the late 90s and early 2000s, right? They continued this thing and then they started actually manufacturing lighters. In 2001, they did 500 million, right? Today, China produces 15 billion lighters. I mean, that's 2017 data, and accounts for 70% of the world market, right? It's very interesting. And of course, they're the largest smokers, but lighters are used also they supply about 70% of the EU market. There's a large supply to the US market, and lighters are also one of the items of friction between EU and China and Russia, China and US. So what they did, and this is very typically different from what we hear the stories of China, how the banks intervene and all. This was all done differently. There is one town in China which accounts for 50% of the global wooden toys production. One town. Very close to Delhi. The second story is very close to Delhi. There is a town which manufactures ladies' footwear. 3,000 families, each family producing 30 to 50 pairs of ladies' footwear a day. As good in scale as any Chinese entity, you can do the maths. But they buy the raw material on credit, they supply the markets in that area on credit, and they get paid later after the raw material supplier deducts that. Somebody, UNIDO, did a study, let's say, and said you can reduce the cost and increase the scale if we do collective purchase of raw materials. While there's a scheme, it didn't work. So these people are still stuck with high cost of raw material, high cost of power, and working on this slip business, the second story. And therefore they cannot access technology, they can't get a whole lot of other stuff which needs to do. The third story is, can people get together and actually address it? And typically you talked of Amul. So people were selling milk was getting diluted, we didn't want to buy. Amul developed a very simple test to check, a specific gravity check to check the dilution of milk, created the supply chain, and the rest is history. But we've been unable to replicate that model across different states. So replicability and repeatability in India needs to be addressed if you look at a particular sector. And in the light of milk, last few months you heard the story of milk being actually thrown on the road because they couldn't find a remunerative price. That is because we're not linked into the global value chains and we don't add value to the milk that we produce. So three things that we could do. One is, from the three stories, do we focus on specific sectors? China focused on 7 sectors: IT, new economy, new materials, high-end manufacturing, alternate fuels, and said we're going to focus on this. Could Make in India be modified to do this? How do we integrate into global value chains? In fact, MSMEs are benefiting by the digital revolution in India. And let me give you one example. You've heard of Oyo, right? So we had these large hotel chains, right? But the small tourism hotels and small things with 5 rooms, 10 rooms, 15 rooms, you couldn't understand the quality or where they're available, you could not book. Oyo came using digital technology, created a standard, and now you can actually do a lot of stuff there. Can it be scaled? By the way, Oyo has now over 250,000 rooms in China. So if you look at it, it is possible for a small and medium company to actually help people grow going forward. Similarly, Zomato. Small restaurants, which are specialty restaurants, could not do home delivery. Now, if you have kids in that age group, I'm sure they choose the best restaurant, and now with the IPL season coming up from today evening, you'll find that sales and people will order in more food. This was not possible a few years ago. So these demonstrate how within India, we can integrate into value chains and actually scale. So the next big thing we need to do is how do these same MSMEs actually integrate into global value chains and we scale. If you look at the last 5 to 10 years, whenever anybody talks about the MSME, they say we have so many units, we account for so much employment, it's going up. But the share of gross value addition or the share of GDP has remained a constant. If we really have to ensure that this sector grows, the share of GDP and the share of gross value added has to increase to at least the levels that of the countries that we've talked about. And the few things that I've talked about could actually enable that to happen. So again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and thank you very much for the patient hearing.